For 13 years, one woman ran a house whose kitchen was in a different building. Every meal that reached the table crossed a stretch of ground underground first. She was not defeated by the carrying. In 12 of those years, she lost 10 cooks. And the record of what finally went wrong at Uppark is a record of people leaving, not of anybody collapsing. Uppark stands above the village of South Harding in West Sussex on the top of the South Downs. It was built around 1690 for Ford Grey, the first Earl of Tankerville, and the architect is believed to have been William Tallman. It is listed at Grade 1. So are 2 other buildings on the site, and the listing for one of them contains a sentence that most people read straight past. The building is the old laundry and kitchen block. It stands to the northeast of the house. Sir Matthew Fetherstonhaugh put it up around 1770, along with a matching stable block to the northwest, and both were listed on 18 June 1959. Red brick, hipped slate roofs, turret cupolas, handsome buildings, deliberately balanced and deliberately apart from the house. Here is the sentence. They are connected with the main building by underground passages, which, beneath the roundel outside the front door, meet a third passage coming from the back door to the north. That is a plan, not a description. 2 passages come in from 2 separate working buildings. A third comes out of the back of the house. All 3 meet at one point, and that point is under the circle of gravel where the carriages pulled up at the front door. The National Trust, which has owned Uppark since 1954, records what used the passages. Servants carried food from the kitchen using the underground tunnels, and from here it could be served to guests in the next-door dining room. If you want more houses like this one, and the people who kept them running, subscribe. That is the whole arrangement, and it decides everything that follows. The dinner was cooked in one building. It was eaten in another, and the ground between them was crossed below. Now, hold on to the building rather than the sentence. The kitchen block was not a curiosity or a survival. It was the working kitchen of Uppark until Miss Frances Fetherstonhaugh died in 1895. Which means that for every one of the 13 years we are going to spend in this house, every meal came out of that building and went under the ground to reach the table. The person responsible for making sure it arrived on time was the housekeeper. Her name was Sarah Wells, and by the end of it she was writing in her diary about what she and her family were going to live on. Start with where you are, because at Uppark that is not a detail. The downs run east and west across Sussex and Hampshire, and Uppark sits on top of them, looking south. The best description of the setting was written by someone who knew the house from the inside. Uppark is a handsome, great house looking southward, with beech woods and bracken thickets to shelter the dappled fallow deer of its wide, undulating downland park. That is H.G. Wells, writing in 1934. We will come back to him properly, for now he is useful for one thing only, which is that he is a witness who lived at Uppark at the level we are interested in, and he noticed distances. He noticed, for instance, that the walled gardens containing the gardener's cottage his father occupied were situated 300 or 400 yards or more away from the main buildings. 300 or 400 yards, not a stroll across a lawn, a walk. The walled kitchen garden is still there. 450 meters northeast of the house. It measures roughly 170 meters by 100 meters, with the corners cut off, and it dates from around 1732. There is a sundial in the middle of it, given by the Duke and Duchess of Bedford around 1812. Take those two numbers together for a moment. 450 meters out to the garden, roughly 170 meters by 100 meters of ground once you are inside it. That is where a good deal of what you were going to eat actually grew, and every item of it had to come back in. It is worth knowing what paid for all of this, because the money is not incidental to how the house was run. Uppark was bought in 1747 by Sir Matthew Fetherstonhaugh, who lived from 1714 to 1774 for £19,000. He then spent over £16,000 transforming it, which is to say he spent nearly as much again on the house as he had spent acquiring it. He and his wife Sarah went on a grand tour between 1749 and 1751 and came back with a great deal of what is still inside. What the money bought is worth naming because it comes back later. Sir Matthew and Sarah went to Europe between 1749 and 1751 and collected on the way. Paintings by Battoni and by Vernet came home with them, along with a great deal else, and those objects became the contents of the house. A country house of this period is not only a building, it is a building with a collection inside it, and the collection is the visible proof that the money exists. Where the 19,000 came from is a question the National Trust now answers directly. Sir Matthew held major shares in the East India Company. He invested in the Grand Ohio Company, which was buying land in North America that belonged to indigenous nations. There is a folly on the estate called the Vandalian Tower, and it is named for a proposed British colony in what is now West Virginia. The trust also records possible links to the Uppark pen plantation in Jamaica, worked by enslaved people. So the house on the top of the downs, with its balanced brick blocks and its passages under the gravel, was built out of a fortune assembled a long way from Sussex. It was assembled at considerable cost to people who never saw it. That is not a moral aside. It is the reason the establishment is the size it is. A household of this scale exists because income arrives from somewhere else and keeps arriving whether or not anybody at Uppark does anything in particular, which produces a specific and slightly strange result below stairs. The work of the house is not what generates the money. The work of the house is what converts the money into the appearance of a life. And appearance, unlike agriculture or trade, has no slack in it. A field can have a bad year. A dinner cannot be 40 minutes late. The house itself did not always look the way it does now. Between 1810 and 1814, Humphrey Repton altered it. He added a single-story stone colonnade on the north side. He extended the plan from an H shape to an oblong. He moved the approach so that the way in was from the north, along a graveled drive with an avenue, and between 1812 and 1813, a portico of Portland stone went up on that north front. Notice what that does to the geography of the place. The front door moves. The carriages arrive on the other side. The roundel of gravel where they pull up is now on the north, which is the side facing the working buildings. and under that gravel, 3 passages meet. You are not going to be told, at any point in this episode, that the people who worked here were destroyed by it. They were not. They did the job for generations, and most of them did it competently. The question is narrower and more interesting than that. It is what the job actually consisted of, and why a modern person dropped into it with the general competence a modern person has would be no use at all. The first reason is the one you can see from the drive. The house does not contain its own kitchen. Stand on the north front, with your back to the portico, and you are looking at a composition. To the northeast, the old laundry and kitchen block. To the northwest, the stable block, both by Sir Matthew Fetherstonhaugh, both around 1770, both grade 1, both listed on the same day in 1959. They are matched deliberately. The stable block has the same red brick, the same hipped slate roof, the same projecting center bays under a pediment, and behind its south wing there are 2 more wings at right angles, forming 3 sides of a courtyard. Architecturally, this is a pair of bookends. Functionally, it is something else. It is the food on one side and the horses on the other, and the family in the middle, and none of the 3 sharing a roof. There is a third piece. West of the stable block, joined to it by a red brick wall at the southwest corner, stands the dairy. It is grade 2, listed on the same day as the others, dated to around 1810, and attributed to Humphrey Repton. It has a small portico of 4 columns, forming 3 sides of an octagon, a lead roof and a ball finial, and a round-headed window that still has its glazing bars, glazed with colored glass. There are also 2 brick pavilions from around 1750. One of them was the greenhouse and laundry building, a 2-story pavilion with an orangery in it, and it is a tea room now. So the working estate of Uppark, at the point where this story happens, is not a service wing attached to a house. It is a small cluster of separate buildings, each doing one job, arranged around a house that does none of them. Milk and butter in the dairy, west of the stables. Heat, water, fire and food in the kitchen block, northeast. Linen in the laundry. Vegetables and fruit, 450 meters out through the walled garden. Horses and carriages northwest. And the people who ate all of it, sitting in rooms that contained none of it. Every one of those separations is sensible on its own terms. A detached kitchen keeps fire away from a house full of paintings. It keeps smoke and smell out of the rooms. It gives the cook space and light. Country houses across England were built this way, and nobody thought it strange. But a sensible separation is still a separation. Once the buildings are apart, something has to cross the ground between them, and the something is a person. That is the shape of the problem, and it raises the obvious question about the passages, which is why they are there at all. The answer is less settled than you might expect. It is worth being exact here, because this is the point where most accounts of houses like Uppark stop being careful. What the record establishes is this: the passages exist. They connect the working blocks to the main building. They meet at a junction beneath the roundel outside the front door, where a third passage comes in from the back door to the north. Food was carried through them from the kitchen to a point from which it could be served in the next-door dining room. That is a great deal to know. It is also all of it. What the record does not establish, at least not in anything you can go and read, is why they were dug. And the two obvious explanations are both entirely reasonable, which is exactly why you cannot simply pick one. The first explanation is concealment. Great houses of this period were increasingly designed so that the work supporting them was not visible from the rooms where the family lived, or from the approach where visitors arrived. On that reading, the passages exist so that the sight of a footman with a tray does not interrupt the view from the portico. The second explanation is practical, and it comes from the buildings themselves. If your kitchen is 100 meters or so from your dining room, and it rains on the downs, and it is February, then an open crossing is not a problem of appearances. It is a problem of food. A covered route is a covered route whether or not anybody cares who sees you. Both motives were normal. Both were current. Neither is written down at Uppark in a form that settles it. One published description of the house says the tunnels were lit by skylights cunningly incorporated into the flower beds. That is a lovely detail, and it may well be right, but it appears in a guide rather than in a survey, so treat it as a description and not as a proven fact. That same description dates the separate buildings to the 19th century, where the statutory listing puts them at around 1770, so the two accounts do not agree even about when. You may find that unsatisfying. It should not be. The reason why is genuinely open. The consequence is not open at all, and the consequence is what this episode is about. Because whatever the passages were dug for, they had one effect that nobody has to speculate about. They put the route between the kitchen and the table underground, out of the weather, out of the daylight, and out of sight of anybody who could correct you. Think about what a cooked dinner actually is, physically, at the moment it leaves a kitchen. It is hot. It is arranged. It is, in the sense that matters, finished. Nothing that happens to it after this point can improve it. Everything that happens to it after this point can only preserve it or spoil it. Now put a building between it and the person who is going to eat it. The food leaves the kitchen block on the northeast. It goes down. It travels along a passage. It arrives at a junction under the gravel of the forecourt, where two other passages come in. It goes up into the house. It reaches a point from which it can be carried into the dining room next door. There is nothing dramatic in that sequence. There is also nothing forgiving in it. The list of things you would have to know is short and unforgiving. You would have to know which passage. You would have to know the junction, in the dark or near dark, carrying something with both hands. You would have to know how long the route takes, not roughly, but exactly, because the difference between food that arrives hot and food that arrives warm is measured in the minutes you spend underground. You would have to know when to leave the kitchen in order to arrive at the right moment, which means knowing what is happening in a room you cannot see, in a building you are not currently in. None of that is written down anywhere for you to consult. It is not in a manual. It could not be in a manual, because it is specific to this house, these passages, and this distance. It exists only in the heads of the people who already work here. That is the first thing that would defeat you at Uppark, and it has nothing to do with strength. You could be perfectly capable of carrying the tray. You would simply not know when to pick it up. And there is a second thing, which follows from the first. Because the route is underground and enclosed, nobody upstairs can see that you are late until you fail to arrive. There is no partial warning. The system gives no signal between departure and arrival. You are either on time or you are the reason dinner is not. Before going further, it is worth settling what you would actually be, because in a household of this kind, that is not a question of talent. The great house of the period ran on ranks, and the ranks were explicit. Cassell's Household Guide, one of the standard domestic manuals of the era, sets them out plainly and without embarrassment. It names a cook, a housemaid, a parlor maid, a lady's maid, a laundry maid, a nurse and a nursery maid, and a page for errands and the dirtier work. Above them, in a large establishment, come the upper servants. The guide is clear about what governs the lot of them. Early rising is an essential quality, it says, and it means about 6 in the morning. It advises that written rules should be legibly and tersely written and pasted on the walls of the kitchen. It is against servants keeping followers and against personal items being on display. It also has views about money. A general servant might get from 7 or 8 pounds a year up to 16, depending on experience and the size of the house. The guide suggests raising a good servant by £1 a year rather than starting anyone high, and it puts the principle bluntly. Better to pay for length of service than for the qualities naturally supposed to be possessed by servants in their respective places. Published wage tables compiled for English country house service around 1890 give a rough shape to the rest of the hierarchy. A housekeeper at 35 to 50 pounds a year, a butler at 40 to 60, a cook from 30 upward, a lady's maid at 20 to 30, a housemaid at 16, a kitchen maid at 15, a scullery maid at 13, and a laundry maid the same. Those are compiled figures and not Uppark's own books, so treat them as the scale of the thing rather than as this household's accounts. Where surviving accounts do exist, they are more interesting than the tables. At Chatsworth in 1862, the housemaid Eliza Jones was recorded as receiving £44, 8 shillings and 10 pence, described as a year's wages and board wages, after deductions. By 1909, the first housemaid there, Jane Miller, had £30 a year, the third housemaid, Eva James, had 20, and the seventh housemaid, Ellen Blagg, had 14. 7 housemaids, numbered, and a gap of £16 between the top of the list and the bottom. One more thing about the ranks, because it bears directly on what happens later. The hierarchy was not only about pay, it was about who was allowed to know things. An upper servant knew the shape of the day. A housekeeper knew the stores, the accounts, the linen, the still room and the standing of everyone under her. A butler knew the cellar and the plate. Below that line, knowledge was issued rather than held. You were told when to go, not why then. In a compact house, that distinction is mostly a matter of dignity. At Uppark, it is operational. The route between the kitchen and the dining room is a passage under the forecourt. The timing of that route is carried in the heads of the people who already know it. So the household's most important asset is not a room or an object. It is the accumulated memory of a small number of experienced people, and that memory has to be transferred to every new arrival by somebody. That is the world you are entering, and you are entering it at the bottom of it. Not because you are unskilled in general, because you are unskilled here. And that has a specific consequence in a house built like Uppark. A newcomer at the bottom of a household is given the tasks that require the least local knowledge. But at Uppark, almost every task requires local knowledge, because almost every task involves getting something from one building to another at a fixed time, which is why the person who decides what you do and when, and whether you are any good at it, matters more here than she would somewhere with a kitchen down the corridor. Take a working day from the beginning, and take it in the form the period itself prescribed. The household manuals of the era are specific about the hour. Cassell's Household Guide states that early rising is an essential quality, and the hour it has in mind is around 6 in the morning. That is not a house waking at 6. That is the staff being at work at 6, so that the house can wake later into rooms that are already warm, already clean, and already supplied. Everything in that sentence is a task, and every task at Uppark has a distance attached to it. Fires have to be laid before the rooms are used, which means coal has to have arrived where the fires are. Water has to be where it is wanted. Floors have to be done before anybody walks on them. Boots, linen, plate, lamps, and grates all belong to somebody's early list. In a house with a basement kitchen, you carry these things up a stair. At Uppark, a good deal of what you are carrying starts in a different building. And it starts in a different building at the coldest and darkest part of the day, in a passage, before the household above you is awake to notice whether you have gone the right way. Here is the part a modern person consistently underestimates. None of this is difficult work in the sense of being complicated. Laying a fire is not complicated. Carrying hot water is not complicated. What is difficult is that all of it has to be finished by a moment, and the moment is defined by other people's waking, and you are being judged not on effort, but on whether the room was ready. There is no partial credit in that structure. A room is ready or it is not. A fire is lit or it is not. By the time anyone upstairs opens a door, the correct state of affairs is that nothing appears to have been done at all. The work has to be complete, and it has to be invisible, and those two requirements pull in opposite directions, because the more thoroughly you have done it, the more of it there was to do. That is the shape of the first 3 hours. Now consider that you are doing it in a house you do not know, on routes that are underground, with a schedule nobody has written down. The Victorian household did not leave its expectations to be inferred. It wrote them out. Cassell's advice on this is almost brusque. Written rules should be legibly and tersely written, and pasted on the walls of the kitchen, not explained, not negotiated. Pasted up, where the work happens, where everybody will see them and nobody can claim not to have. What those rules covered is worth pausing on, because it goes well past the working day. The guide is against followers, which is the period's word for a servant's romantic visitors. It is against personal items being on display. It expects modest dress, quiet movement, and restricted access to the family's rooms. It is, in other words, regulating not only what you do, but where your body is allowed to be and what evidence of your own existence you are permitted to leave lying about. That last point is the one that matters here. In a house like Uppark, where the physical route to the dining room runs under the front lawn, the rule about not being visible is not a manner. It is architecture with a paragraph attached. One honest limitation before going further. These manuals describe prescribed general practice for households of the period. They are not a recovered Uppark timetable. No day-by-day rota for this house survives in a form you can read. So what follows is the shape the period expected, laid over a building whose distances we do know. That distinction holds for the rest of the episode, and it will not be repeated. Within that limit, the manuals are extremely useful, because they tell you what a household of this type considered obvious. And what it considered obvious is that a servant's competence was measured in compliance rather than initiative. That falls hardest on a newcomer. In most modern work, when you do not know something, the correct response is to ask. In this system, asking is a small confession, and confessions are recorded against you by people who are also your housing, your food, and your reference for every job you will ever hold afterwards. So you would not ask, you would guess. And at Uppark, guessing means guessing about a route you cannot see the end of. Go down into the house itself now, because the basement is not one undifferentiated space. The rooms shown at Uppark below stairs include a still room, a butler's pantry, a housekeeper's room, and a lower servants' hall. 4 rooms, 4 functions, 4 sets of things that belong in one place and nowhere else. The still room is where preserving, preparing, and the lighter kinds of production happened, and the National Trust describes it as a good example of a downstairs kitchen. Note the word downstairs. It is a kitchen in the house. It is not the kitchen. The kitchen is still outside, northeast, across the ground. The butler's pantry is where the plate and the glass and the immediate business of serving lived, under the authority of the man responsible for them. The housekeeper's room is where the woman who ran the domestic side of the establishment kept her accounts, her stores, and her authority. We will spend a good deal of time in that room later, and the National Trust now describes it, in one line, as once home to the mother of H.G. Wells. The lower servants' hall is where the lower servants ate. There is one more space worth standing in. The beer and wine cellar at Uppark has columns and vaulting, and they are there because they are carrying the marble floor of the saloon above. Take that literally for a moment. In the room where the household's drink was kept, the ceiling is a structural system holding up the room where the household's guests stood. The 2 floors are not metaphorically related. One is physically bearing the other. Now count what the below-stairs rooms do and do not contain. They contain stores, plate, accounts, preparation, and the people. They do not contain the cooking of dinner. That single absence is the reason the passages exist, and it is the reason your working day is not a circuit inside a building. It is a shuttle between buildings, and the shuttle has a timetable that nobody has given you. There is an object in this story that explains the whole system better than any document, and it is a toy. Around 1730, a girl of about 10 named Sarah Lethioulier was given a doll's house. Her father, Christopher Lethioulier, was a wealthy merchant and a director of the Bank of England, and the house was bought fully equipped in 1732 from Christopher Cock, an auctioneer in Covent Garden. It was not made up piece by piece over years. It was purchased complete. Sarah Lethethulier later married Sir Matthew Fetherstonhaugh, and when he bought Uppark in 1747, the doll's house came with her. It stayed there. H.G. Wells, growing up in the basement more than a century later, remembered playing with it under what he called imperious direction. It contains around 700 miniature objects. There is silver for lighting, for dining, and for tea, hallmarked by David Clayton, a London silversmith who specialized in miniatures. There are ivory chairs, turned by specialists, probably second-generation Huguenot craftsmen. There is a state bedroom. And there are the service quarters. This is the point. The doll's house does not stop at the rooms a visitor would see. It reproduces the range of reception rooms and service quarters that a girl of her class might expect to manage if she made a suitable marriage. It is furnished with wooden dolls representing the lady of the house and her servants in their relative positions, which means it was not principally a plaything. It has been described as an instruction manual in three-dimensional form, and that is exactly right. A 10-year-old was handed a scale model of an establishment and expected to learn, by handling it, where everything and everybody went. Sit with the implication for a second. The people at the top of this system were trained for it, not casually and not by accident. A girl was given the entire arrangement in miniature, at an age when other things are still toys, so that by the time she had a real house, she would already know its shape. She would know that there is a state bedroom, and there are service quarters, and she would know which of them contains which kind of person. Nobody did that for the servants. There was no scale model of Uppark issued to a new cook in 1885, showing the kitchen block, the passages, the junction under the roundel, and the dining room on the far side of it. There was no diagram of the route, no timing chart, no instruction manual in three-dimensional form. The knowledge that made the house work sat in the heads of the people already doing the work, and it was transmitted, when it was transmitted at all, by one person telling another while both of them were busy. So the household contained two kinds of understanding of itself. One was formal, purchasable, and had been arranged in advance for a child. The other was informal, unwritten, and had to be reconstructed by hand every time somebody left. The doll's house is now on loan from the National Trust to the Huguenot Museum in Rochester, and it survives in a condition that the house it came from does not, for reasons we will get to. But when it was standing at Uppark in the 1880s, in a building whose kitchen was outside and whose servants moved underneath the forecourt, it was a small, beautifully made, 700-piece answer to a question the real house never bothered to answer for anybody below stairs. Where does everything go, and who goes with it? Almost everything in a great house could be moved. The dinner hour could not. Understand what a fixed hour does to a system with distance in it. It converts every other variable into a dependency. The cook cannot decide when the food is finished, because the food has to be finished at a time that allows for the crossing. The person carrying it cannot decide when to leave, because leaving is calculated backwards from an hour that belongs to somebody else. And the housekeeper who is responsible for the whole sequence, cannot fix any of it directly. She can only make sure that everyone else's clock agrees. That is the actual job at the top of this household, and it is worth naming plainly, because it is not what people imagine. The housekeeper is not principally a cleaner or a supervisor of cleaners. She is the person who holds a distributed schedule in her head and keeps separated buildings in agreement. Now add the failure modes. If the cook is new, the cook does not yet know how long the crossing takes in this house, so the cook's estimate of when to finish is wrong, and it is wrong in a direction nobody can see until the food arrives. If the carrier is new, the carrier is slow underground, because the carrier is being careful, and being careful is the correct instinct and also the expensive one. If the hour changes because guests are late, or because the family has changed its mind, then a message has to travel from the house to a building outside it in time to be useful. And messages travel at walking pace, along the same passages, through the same junction under the gravel. There is a name for a system like this. It is a system with no buffer. Everything works when everybody knows their part, and nothing degrades gracefully when one person does not. You would be the one person who does not. It is worth being careful here, because this is exactly the point where accounts of Victorian service reach for a disaster that did not happen. Nothing is going to be invented in this episode. No burst pipe, no drop tureen, no ruined dinner, no dismissal on the spot. There is no record of any such incident at Uppark and no reason to manufacture one. What can be said, and what is much more useful, is what class of things the arrangement makes irreversible. Heat is the first. A dish that has cooled between the kitchen block and the dining room cannot be reheated into the dish it was. It can be reheated into a different and worse dish, and that is a decision somebody has to take in the moment, with the hour already passing. Arrangement is the second. Food leaves a kitchen composed. Whatever the passage does to it is done, and it is done in a place where nobody senior is standing. Sequence is the third, and it is the one people forget. A dinner is not a set of dishes. It is an order of dishes, with intervals between them. Miss one interval, and every later interval moves. And the whole evening upstairs is now being conducted at a rhythm the kitchen did not choose and cannot see. And the fourth is the simplest: time. The hour that has passed is gone. There is no version of the underground route that runs faster because you now understand its importance. None of these are dramatic. That is precisely why they are dangerous to a newcomer. A newcomer expects the test to be visible. The test here is a set of quiet, unrecoverable losses, and the person who notices them first is the housekeeper, and the record of her noticing is not a scene. It is a turnover figure, which we will come to. To see what the arrangement could be asked to do at full stretch, go back a couple of generations, to the same buildings and a different family. In 1784, there was a party at Uppark for the Prince of Wales. The provisioning for it survives. It lists 2 bucks, a Welsh sheep, a dozen ducks, 4 hams, dozens of pigeons and rabbits, flitches of bacon, lobsters and prawns, and a turtle of 120 pounds. Read that list as freight rather than as menu. 2 deer, a whole sheep, 12 ducks, 4 hams, pigeons and rabbits by the dozen, sides of bacon, shellfish, which has to be kept alive or kept cold, and a turtle weighing 120 pounds, which one person cannot carry, and which will not fit through anything designed for a tray. Every item on that list had to arrive at the kitchen block. Every item that became a dish had to leave the kitchen block. And in between the two, the ground had to be crossed, in the direction of a dining room in another building, along a passage that meets 2 other passages under the gravel at the front door. This is 1784, which is 96 years before the housekeeper we are following takes the post, and the household of the 1780s is not the household of the 1880s. Sir Harry Fetherstonhaugh was entertaining the future king. The later house was 2 elderly women and their staff, but the buildings did not change. The kitchen block that fed the Prince of Wales in 1784 was still the working kitchen of Uppark until 1895. The passages that carried that dinner are the passages that carried every later one, which means the arrangement was built for the largest occasion the house would ever attempt, and then kept in service for a century afterwards, long past the point where anybody needed to move a turtle. That is worth holding on to. Systems designed for the exceptional day do not get simpler when the exceptional day stops coming. They just carry on requiring the same number of people to be in the right place. Here is the reframe, and it changes what the rest of this house means. Everything described so far, the separated buildings, the underground junction, the fixed hour, the invisible early morning, the rules pasted on a wall, is usually presented as evidence of how hard the servants worked. It is evidence of that, but it is not what the system was for. The system was for the appearance of ease. Here is what a guest arriving at Uppark in the 1880s would have met. A graveled drive up to a Portland stone portico, a house that looks calm, rooms that are warm without anybody having been seen to warm them, dinner that arrives at the hour, hot, in order, from no visible direction, no smoke, no noise of a kitchen, no traffic across the forecourt. The only thing under the gravel where the carriage stops is gravel. That impression is not an absence of work. It is the product. It is what the household manufactured every day out of distance, timing and a small number of people who knew the routes. And once you see the appearance of ease as the output, the strange design decisions stop being strange. The kitchen is outside because a kitchen inside would be evidence. The passages are underground because a route on the surface would be evidence. The rules about visibility and personal belongings exist because a servant's presence is evidence. The whole apparatus is engineered to remove traces of itself. The cost of that is structural. A house that hides its own operation has no way of showing you when the operation is failing. There is no dial. There is no visible cue. The signal that something has gone wrong is that something has already gone wrong upstairs, in front of guests, at the one moment that cannot be repeated. So the household needs a person who can see the whole thing at once, in their head, without any instrument to help them. It needs somebody to be the dial. At Uppark, from 1880, that person was Sarah Wells. She was in her late 50s when she took the post. She had been a lady's maid, not a housekeeper, and the house she was now holding together in her head had its kitchen in a separate building on the other side of the forecourt. She arrived the first time in 1850, and she arrived as somebody else. Sarah Neal was born in 1822. In 1850, she came to Uppark as maid to Miss Bullock, and by the census of 1851, she is recorded there in the household of Miss Frances Bullock Fetherstonhaugh. She was 28 or thereabouts, in a job that put her physically closer to the family than almost anybody else in the house, and gave her no authority whatsoever. A lady's maid is a particular kind of servant. She handles clothes, hair, jewelry, and the small daily management of another woman's appearance. She is in the bedroom. She is trusted with things that are private. And she is, in the structure of the household, an upper servant, which means she eats apart from the lower servants and holds a rank that other servants recognize. What a lady's maid does not do is run anything. She has no stores, no accounts, no staff under her, and no schedule to hold. Her work is close, personal, and entirely contained. This matters, and it will matter enormously in 30 years. In 1851, there was also a gardener at Uppark named Joseph Wells. The walled kitchen garden, as we have seen, is 450 meters out from the house. Wells later described the walled gardens and the gardener's cottage his father occupied as 300 or 400 yards or more away from the main buildings. So the two of them were employed on the same estate at a distance of a walk. They married in 1853, and that ended it. A married woman did not stay in service in a house like this, and Sarah Neal became Sarah Wells and left. Hold the shape of that first period, because it is the foundation of everything that goes wrong later. She knew Uppark. She knew the family. She knew the rooms, the hours, the manners, and the people. What she had never done, in this house or any other, was hold the schedule. The years between are not decoration. They explain the terms she came back on. The Wells family took a shop in Bromley, in Kent, at Atlas House, 162 High Street. They sold china and sporting goods. It did not prosper. The stock was old and worn, and the location was poor, and the business that was supposed to keep a household going did not keep it going. Joseph Wells had other income for a time. He played cricket professionally. But an income from cricket is an income with a body attached to it, and bodies do not stay in that condition. 4 children were born. The third son, Herbert George, arrived on 21 September 1866, and his mother recorded it in her diary, as she recorded a great deal else, because she kept diaries all her life. That habit is the reason we know any of this in her own words. Her diaries survive at the West Sussex Record Office under the reference Ad Misty 41,235, catalogued as Sarah Wells Diaries, with domestic household notes. Domestic household notes, a whole life of managing shortage, filed under a phrase that could describe a shopping list. By 1880, the situation was as follows. The shop had failed to provide. The children needed placing, and Sarah Wells was 57 or 58 years old, which in 1880 is not an age at which employers are looking for you. What she had was the one thing a great house values above almost everything, which is that they already knew her. She had been at Uppark. Miss Frances Bullock Fetherstonhaugh, who had inherited the place from her sister Mary Ann in 1874, knew who she was. So the offer, when it came, was not really an offer of a housekeeper's post to a qualified housekeeper. It was an offer of a post to a known person. Those are not the same transaction, and the difference is the whole of what follows. In 1880, Sarah Wells became housekeeper at Uppark. The National Trust's own collections catalog records it plainly, against a photograph of her in a carved oak frame. Housekeeper at Uppark from 1880 to 1893, to Miss Frances Bullock Fetherstonhaugh, accession number NT 138,084. Born 1822, died 1905. Mother of the author H.G. Wells. The terms she accepted were these. She was returning to a house she had left as a lady's maid, into the senior domestic post, without ever having done that job. The distance between those two roles is not seniority. It is category. One is close personal work with no system attached. The other is nothing but system. She was doing it at an age when starting anything is difficult, in a body that would be described by 1893 as hobbled by rheumatism. And there was a condition. One of the terms of her work was that she would not be permitted living space at Uppark for her husband and children. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the sharpest thing in the record. The house she was now responsible for running as a home would not house her own family. The place where she held the keys was a place her husband could not live. That is not cruelty in any personal sense. It was ordinary. A housekeeper's post came with a room, and the room was for the housekeeper, and a servant's family was a servant's own problem. But ordinary arrangements have consequences. This one meant that the person holding the household together had no household of her own to go back to at the end of the day, and nobody on the premises whose interest was hers. She had taken a post that gave her authority over everybody in the building and companionship with nobody in it. Above her were two elderly women. Wells, writing much later, described the situation as he found it in the 1880s, when the two surviving ladies, Miss Bullock, who took the name Fetherstonhaugh after her sister's death, and Miss Sutherland, were very old ladies indeed. So the establishment in 1880 was this: two aged mistresses, one newly promoted housekeeper who had never run a household, a kitchen in a separate building, a dining room reached through a passage under the front lawn, and a fixed hour every evening at which all of it had to arrive in the same place at the same time. Before the crisis, the ordinary work, because the ordinary work is what a person is actually hired to do, and it is almost never described. A housekeeper in a house of this kind held four things. She held the stores, groceries, preserves, candles, soap, tea, sugar, dry goods, anything that arrived in quantity and was issued in small amounts. In practice, that means she held the keys, and holding the keys meant that no one else could take anything without going through her. That is not a symbol of authority. It is an inventory control system implemented as a person. She held the linen, sheets, tablecloths, napkins, towels, everything that goes out dirty and has to come back clean, counted both ways. At Uppark, the laundry was in one of the brick pavilions of around 1750, which is to say, The linen also went outside and came back, along with everything else. She held the still room and the lighter production that happened in it, preserving, bottling, the making of things that would be needed later and had to be made now. And she held the book, the accounts, what came in, what it cost, what was used, what remained. In a household where the family's money arrived from elsewhere and the house's job was to convert it into a way of living, the housekeeper's book is the place where that conversion was written down and could be checked. Cassell's Household Guide, setting out how such a house should be run, is emphatic that the rules should be pasted up in the kitchen where everyone can read them. What it does not say, because it did not need to, is that somebody has to write those rules, apply them, notice when they are broken, and decide what happens next. In a large establishment, that somebody is the housekeeper. There is a detail in Wells's novel that catches the character of the work better than any manual. In the housekeeper's room at Bladesover, on the little dresser, he puts an old peerage and a Crockford, together with the books of recipes and Whitaker's Almanac. Reference works and recipes on the same shelf. It is fiction, and Wells warned us that the housekeeper in it is not his mother. But the shelf is not a character. It is a description of a job. The person in that room had to answer questions about rank, about clergy, about dates and weights and measures, and how a thing was made. At short notice, and correctly, because everybody else in the building was going to act on the answer. Now put that alongside what we know about the woman who took the post at Uppark in 1880. She had been a lady's maid. A lady's maid is trusted, skilled, and close to the family, and none of her work is inventory, accounting, hiring, or scheduling. Sarah Wells had spent her working life in a role with no book to keep, and she was now responsible for the book, the keys, the linen, the still room, the staff, and the hour. She had also spent the previous 27 years running a shop that failed. That is not a criticism of her. It is a description of what she was being asked to do, and by whom, and with what preparation. She was 57 or 58. She had no training in the job, and the house she was doing it in had put its kitchen in a different building. Now take the single most useful number in this entire story, and be careful with it, because it is easy to read as gossip, and it is not gossip. It is a measurement. Tessa Bowace, whose study of English country house housekeepers worked directly from Sarah Wells's diaries, records that the Uppark household went through 10 cooks in 12 years. A cook in this house was a particular kind of employee. The cook worked in the kitchen block, northeast of the house, across the ground, in a separate building. The cook was responsible for producing finished food to an hour set elsewhere, without being able to see the room it was going to. The cook's output then left the building and traveled underground before anybody upstairs saw it. And the cook was, in the ordinary hierarchy of the period, one of the best paid people in the establishment. Published tables for the era put a country house cook at £30 a year and upward, with the very best commanding far more, in a household where a scullery maid was on 13. That is a senior, expensive, hard-to-replace post, and it turned over roughly once a year for over a decade. 10 times, a person who knew the route, the timing, and this particular kitchen walked out of it. 10 times, somebody who did not know those things walked in, and each time, The whole informal system of local knowledge that made Uppark work had to be rebuilt inside a new person's head by the housekeeper, while the dinner hour continued to arrive every single evening without adjustment. Now put that against the alternative explanations fairly. You could say the cooks left because the house was remote. It is on top of the downs and it is not near anything. That is true, and it is probably part of it. You could say the cooks left because the wages were poor. There is no Uppark wage book available to check, so that stays open. You could say the cooks left because the mistresses were difficult, or because the house was old-fashioned, or because service everywhere was becoming harder to staff in the 1880s, which it was. All of that may be true. But notice that every one of those explanations still lands on the same person. Whatever drove the cooks out, the consequence of their leaving fell on the housekeeper, because she was the one who had to find the next one, install her, teach her the house, and cover the gap in between. 10 cooks in 12 years is not a measurement of the cooks. It is a measurement of what the job at the top of that household actually was. To understand why 10 cooks in 12 years is a serious number, and not just an inconvenient one, you have to understand what it cost a servant to leave. A servant looking for a new place needed a character. A character was a written testimonial from a former employer, stating that you were trustworthy and able. It was the document on which the whole labor market for domestic service ran. Without one, you were, for practical purposes, unemployable in any respectable household, because no family was going to admit a stranger into their rooms, their plate, and their children's care on your own account of yourself. Now, hold 2 facts about the character next to each other. The first is that an employer was under no legal obligation to give you one. None. A servant might work faithfully for years, be dismissed for any reason or for none, and be sent away without the document required to work again. The second is that if a character was given, it had to be true. A servant who could prove that a false and malicious character had cost them could bring an action for damages, and falsifying one was a criminal matter. The law on it is set out in the Dictionary of Daily Wants, published between 1858 and 1859. If any person falsely personated a master or mistress in order to give a servant a character, the offender forfeited £20 on conviction, with 10 shillings costs. The same penalty fell on a master or mistress who knowingly gave a false character in writing. £20. Set that against the wage tables. A housemaid at £16 a year, a kitchen maid at 15, a scullery maid at 13. The fine for lying about a servant's character was larger than the servant's annual wage, and in several cases substantially larger. The state, in other words, took the accuracy of the document seriously enough to price a lie above a year of the labor it described, and it took the servant's need for the document so lightly that nobody was required to hand one over. That asymmetry is the whole architecture of the relationship. Your employer could not lie about you. Your employer could simply say nothing about you, forever. So consider a cook at Uppark, in a separate building on the top of the downs, in a house where the mistress is elderly, the housekeeper is elderly, and the arrangements are difficult. Leaving is not a resignation. Leaving is a negotiation about a piece of paper. conducted with a person whose goodwill you have possibly just spent. And 10 of them did it anyway, in 12 years. That is what makes the number worth taking seriously. These were not casual departures by people with nothing to lose. Every one of them involved somebody deciding that whatever was waiting for them elsewhere was worth the risk of asking this household for a character. The person they had to ask was the housekeeper. Step back from Uppark for a moment and look at the size of the thing this house was a single instance of. By 1891, more than 1 million women in Britain were in domestic service. Among women between the ages of 15 and 20, it has been estimated that roughly 1 in 3 was a servant. That is not a niche occupation. That is the ordinary destination of a young woman without money, on a scale that makes the great house at the top of the system look less like an eccentricity and more like the visible end of a national arrangement. And at the bottom of it, the wages were smaller than the country house tables suggest. Kitchen maids and maids of all work, the general servants often called slavies, were on something in the region of 6 to 12 pounds a year. The tweenie, the between maid, who worked for both the cook and the housemaid and belonged properly to neither, was paid less again. Now add the detail that makes all of the previous movement bite harder. A servant traveling between places carried a box. In it were the work clothes, the personal possessions, the small accumulation of a life lived in other people's houses. It was, in a fairly literal sense, everything that was not the room she happened to be sleeping in. And a mistress, dismissing a servant, could keep the box. It could be held back against an alleged deficit, a suspected theft, an unproved claim. The servant would leave without the character she needed to get another place, and without the clothes she needed to work in one. A dismissed servant without a character cannot get hired. A dismissed servant without her box cannot present herself, even if she is. The two instruments together mean that the decision to dismiss somebody in this system was not the end of an employment. It was, potentially, the end of the possibility of employment. Which brings the Uppark number back into focus in a colder light. 10 cooks left in 12 years. Every one of those departures was made by a woman who knew exactly what was at stake in it. She was in a market where 1 million other women were competing for places. And the paperwork she needed was in the gift of the household she was walking away from. They did it anyway, 10 times. And every time, the person left standing in the middle of it was a woman in her 60s. She had to find a replacement and get her up onto the top of the South Downs. She had to install her in a kitchen in a separate building and teach her a route she could not see the end of. Dinner continued to happen every evening at the same hour. There is a version of this story that treats domestic service as a costume drama with a hierarchy in it. The figures do not support that reading. This was the largest single employer of women in the country. It ran on a document nobody was obliged to give you, and it could take your clothes. The house on the hill, with the passages under the gravel, was not an exception to that world. It was that world, at the expensive end, with better food. There is a detail in the record that is easy to pass over and impossible to unsee once you have understood how the house worked. Sarah Wells went deaf. So did her employer. Her son, put it with the bluntness of a man writing about his own mother long afterwards. They were two old deaf women at cross purposes. The rather sentimental attachment between them evaporated in mutual irritation and left not a rack behind. Now recall what this household ran on. There is no bell that can tell a cook in a separate building that dinner has moved by 20 minutes. There is no note that reaches the passage. Every adjustment in a house of this kind traveled by voice, from a person who knew to a person who needed to know, in corridors and rooms and at doors. The instruction to change the hour, the warning that guests had arrived, the question about whether the fish had come, the decision about which room to open. All of it was speech. Between the mistress and the housekeeper, that channel was the most important one in the building, because it was the only place where the family's intentions became the household's schedule. Everything downstairs was a translation of something said upstairs. And the two people at either end of that channel could no longer hear each other reliably. It would be easy to make this into a scene, and this episode is not going to. There is no record of a particular misheard order or a particular ruined evening, and inventing one would be worse than useless. What the record supports is narrower and heavier. The single link on which the whole distributed system depended had degraded in both people at once, over years, in a house where the alternative to hearing was walking. And walking at Uppark meant the passages. In the winter of 1887 and 1888, a 20-year-old came to Uppark to get well. Herbert George Wells had been apprenticed and had failed at it more than once. He was ill. His mother was the housekeeper, and the housekeeper had a room, and so he convalesced in the basement of a country house on the top of the South Downs. What he did there is well documented, and it is not a small thing. He got into the library, and in it he found Plato, Voltaire, and Thomas Paine. He got into the attic and found a telescope. A young man with no prospects and a failed apprenticeship behind him spent a winter reading political philosophy in a house that was itself a working model of the class system, and then went upstairs and looked at the sky. He also remembered the below-stairs world with something other than bitterness. Below stairs was gay at Christmas, he wrote, and I was gay with it. That sentence is worth holding on to for the next few minutes, because it is going to do a lot of work. He was, in that winter, in an unusual position. He was not a servant. He was not a guest. He was the housekeeper's son, living in the housekeeper's room, eating where the upper servants ate. He had the run of a library that was not meant for him. His mother's authority over the establishment was the only reason he was there at all, which means that when he later wrote about the system, he was writing as somebody who had seen it from a position almost nobody occupies, not from above, where you see service as a smooth surface, not quite from below, where you see only your own tasks, from the middle, at the exact point where the family's requirements were converted into other people's mornings. And what he saw there, when he came to write it down, is not what most people expect. In 1909, Macmillan published Tono Bungay, and Wells put Uppark in it. He said so himself, without ambiguity, decades later. In a novel of mine, perhaps my most ambitious novel, Tono Bungay, I have made a little picture of Uppark as Bladesover and given a glimpse of its life below stairs. And then, immediately, a correction that matters. But the housekeeper there is not in the least like my mother. That is a precise instruction about how to read the book, and it is worth obeying. The house is Uppark. The people are not portraits. So what the novel gives us is not evidence about Sarah Wells. It is evidence about what the arrangement looked like to somebody who had lived inside it, at the exact height in the household where the arrangement was managed. And what he describes is a system of knowledge. The narrator grows up in the housekeeper's room at Bladesover, and Wells fills it in with an odd and revealing inventory. He calls it the much-cupboarded, white-painted, chintz-brightened housekeeper's room, where the upper servants assembled. On the little dresser there is an old peerage and a Crockford, together with the books of recipes and Whitaker's Almanac. Read that shelf again, because it is the whole thesis in one line of furniture. A peerage is a directory of rank. Crockford's is a directory of clergy. Whitaker's Almanac is a directory of everything else, and they are sitting on the same dresser as the recipes. That is not decoration. It tells you what the senior servant of a great house had to be able to look up at short notice. Because if guests are coming, then somebody has to know their precedence, and precedence decides the order in which people go into dinner, which decides the seating, which decides the service. Getting it wrong is not a social error that can be smoothed over. It is a visible statement, in front of everyone, about who the household believes outranks whom. Wells has his narrator's mother rule on exactly this. No, Miss Fison, peers of England go in before peers of the United Kingdom. Now connect that to the kitchen block outside and the passage under the gravel. The order of the guests determines the shape of the meal. The shape of the meal determines what the kitchen has to produce and when. The timing of the crossing determines when the kitchen has to finish. So a question about the relative rank of two guests, settled from a book on a dresser in a basement room, propagates outward through a separate building on the other side of the forecourt. That is what the job was. Not scrubbing. Lookup, translation, and scheduling, performed by one person, on behalf of a system that had deliberately hidden itself from view. Wells is also precise about the geography of permission. His narrator describes coming down the main service stairs as legal, and says that illegality began at a little landing, where one went through a red baize door. A door covered in green or red baize, on the boundary between the family's part of the house and the working part, deadened sound and marked a line. On one side of it you were where you belonged. On the other side you were trespassing, and the difference was not enforced by a lock. It was enforced by everybody knowing. At the top of the fictional household he puts Lady Drew, described by her own servants as her ladyship, shriveled and garrulous, with a wonderful memory for genealogies. A memory for genealogies. In a house where precedence decided the order of dinner, the mistress's most useful faculty was the same one the housekeeper needed, held at a different altitude. He generalizes from it in the way that made the book famous. In that English countryside of his boyhood, he writes, every human being had a place, and it belonged to you from your birth like the color of your eyes. And then, more sweepingly, that Bladesover is the clue to almost all that is distinctively British, and perplexing to the foreign inquirer. You do not have to accept the whole of that argument, but you should notice what a novelist raised in a basement chose to build his account of England out of. Not cruelty, not hunger, a dresser with a peerage on it, a baize door, and a scale of precedence that ran from the family down through the tenantry, the butler and housekeeper, the village shopkeeper, the head keeper, and the cook. He built it out of information and position, which is exactly what the house was built to manage. Now the objection, and it deserves a proper hearing rather than a straw version. The obvious response to everything so far is that this is an elaborate way of avoiding the real point. Domestic service in the 19th century was hard, badly paid, physically punishing, and frequently degrading. A modern person would not survive it because it was brutal, and a discussion of scheduling and precedence is a distraction from that. There is a great deal of evidence for the brutal reading, and none of it is being denied here. The wage tables alone make the case. A scullery maid at £13 a year, a laundry maid at the same, a kitchen maid at 15, outside the country house entirely, a maid of all work on 6 to 12 pounds, doing every job in a smaller household by herself, with no rank beneath her to hand anything down to. Cassels advises that a good servant be raised by £1 a year rather than started higher. It states flatly that it is better to pay for length of service than for the qualities naturally supposed to be possessed by servants in their respective places. That is a system that prices people low and expects them to stay. But we have a witness, and the witness is not a sentimental one. H.G. Wells spent his adult life attacking the class structure of the country he grew up in. He had every reason, personal and political, to describe the world below stairs at Uppark as squalid. Here is how he actually described it, in his autobiography in 1934. It was a world of other ladies' maids and valets, of house stewards, housekeepers, cooks, and butlers, upper servants above the level of maids and footmen, a downstairs world, but living in plentiful good air, well fed, and fairly well housed in the attics, basements, and interstices of great mansions. Plentiful good air, well fed, fairly well housed. Note the care in the sentence, because it is doing something careful. He specifies who he means. Upper servants, above the level of maids and footmen. He is not describing the scullery. He is describing the layer his mother belonged to, which is the layer he saw from the housekeeper's room. And he adds, elsewhere, that below stairs was gay at Christmas, and that he was gay with it. So the honest version of the objection has to be narrowed. In this house, at this level, the thing that broke a person was not deprivation, it was not hunger, and it was not the roof over the attic bedrooms. The person who broke at Uppark was the woman at the top of the servants' hierarchy. She was fed, she was housed, she had authority, a room of her own, and a rank that other servants recognized. And by 1893, she was 69. She could not hear her employer. She had lost 10 cooks in 12 years, and she had not been able to put aside enough to stop. That is the refined claim, and it is a stronger one than the version it replaces. The great house did not only wear people out through their bodies, it could also wear them out through their memory, their hearing, and their capacity to keep an increasingly complicated schedule in agreement across separated buildings. And when it did that, it did it to the person who was, on paper, doing best. The record of what happened is 3 sentences long. In early 1893, Sarah Wells wrote in her diary, "What shall we do for a living? Please God, find me work to do." How cruel of that woman. She was dismissed that year. She was 69. She was hobbled by rheumatism, and she had not saved enough to retire on, which is why the first of those 3 sentences is a practical question and not a lament. What shall we do for a living is a housekeeper's sentence. It is the sentence of somebody who has spent 13 years making sure that things were arranged in advance, discovering that nothing has been arranged for her. Be clear about what the diary is and is not. It is not a court record, and it is not a neutral account. It is one side of a relationship between 2 people who could no longer hear each other, written by the one who had just lost her position and her home in the same conversation. The word cruel is her judgment, made in the worst week of her working life. We also do not have the other side. Miss Frances Bullock Fetherstonhaugh left no comparable account, and she died 2 years later, in 1895. What can be said with confidence is the sequence. The post was taken in 1880. The employment ended in 1893. The National Trust's collections catalog fixes both dates against her photograph in a carved oak frame, accession number NT 138,084. The diaries themselves are at the West Sussex Record Office, catalogued as Ad Mrs. 41,235, listed as Sarah Wells Diaries with domestic household notes. Those quotations reach us through Tessa Bose's study of country house housekeepers, which worked from the diaries directly. The originals are in the archive. That is the chain, and it is worth stating rather than leaving implied. What happened to Sarah Wells afterwards is much less well recorded than what happened to her before. She lived until 1905, 12 years after leaving Uppark. Her son became one of the most famous writers in the English language. Beyond that, the accessible record thins out very quickly, and rather than fill the gap with plausible sentences, it is better to say plainly that this is where the paper stops. She spent 13 years making sure that a house on top of the Downs appeared to run itself. The surviving record of how that ended is 3 sentences she wrote for nobody. One correction before this house is left, because a claim about Uppark circulates widely and it needs separating from the claim underneath it. You will frequently read that Uppark's underground passages inspired the Morlocks in The Time Machine. The tunnels below the lawn, the people who moved through them unseen, the world beneath the pleasant surface. It is an attractive idea, and the National Trust itself mentions it. The Trust describes Uppark as the inspiration for the fictitious Bladesover house in Tono Bungay. It adds that it is also suggested that Uppark's underground passages may have provided him with the idea for the Morlock tunnels in The Time Machine. Notice the difference in that sentence. One half is a statement. The other half is a suggestion, and the Trust is careful to say so. The Bladesover connection is documented, and documented by Wells. In his own words, naming his own novel and his own house. There is nothing to argue about. The Morlock connection is an inference. It is a reasonable one. Wells did spend a winter in that basement. He did use the tunnels, and he did later write a novel about a society split into an upper world and an underground one. But an inference drawn from a coincidence of imagery is not the same kind of object as a sentence in which an author tells you what he did. It matters here for a specific reason. This episode has just used Wells as a decisive witness about conditions below stairs. If his testimony is going to carry that weight, the record of what he actually said has to be kept clean, and that means not quietly upgrading a suggestion about his imagination into a fact about his life. The stronger point, in any case, is the documented one. Wells did not need to turn Uppark into science fiction to make it strange. He put it in a realist novel, named it Bladesover, and said it was the clue to almost all that is distinctively British. A house with its kitchen in a separate building and its servants moving under the gravel was, to him, not a metaphor for the English class system. It was a working diagram of it. Miss Frances Bullock Fetherstonhaugh died in 1895. She was born in 1819, and she had inherited Uppark from her sister Mary Ann in 1874. Mary Ann had been a dairymaid at Uppark, working in the small brick building west of the stable block, with the colored glass in its round-headed window. In 1825, she married Sir Harry Fetherstonhaugh, who was then about 70, when she was about 20. He died in 1846, and she got the house. So the woman who dismissed Sarah Wells in 1893 was the sister of a dairymaid who had ended up owning the estate. In a story about who was allowed to know things and who was allowed to be seen, that is worth a sentence, and it is worth no more than a sentence, because it is not what this house is for. Here is what matters about 1895. The statutory listing for the old laundry and kitchen block records that the building ceased to work as a kitchen after the death of Miss Frances Fetherstonhaugh. Read that carefully. The kitchen block did not stop being a kitchen when it became inconvenient. It did not stop when the passages became old-fashioned, or when other houses installed kitchens inside themselves, or when the cooks kept leaving. It stopped when the last woman who required it died. The arrangement outlived Sarah Wells's tenure by exactly 2 years. She was dismissed in 1893. The system she had spent 13 years holding in agreement was still running in 1894. And then the person it was running for was gone, and it stopped. That is the shape of a household, not a machine that wears out. A machine that is switched off when its purpose leaves the building. And it tells you something slightly bleak about what those 13 years were, in the end. She had been holding together an arrangement that had less than 2 years left in it. She was doing it for a woman who would outlive her employment by less than 2 years, and the building would stop cooking as soon as both of them were finished with it. Nobody could have known that. It is only visible from here. Between the kitchen going cold in 1895 and the fire in 1989, there are 94 years, and they are worth walking through quickly because they show what a house of this kind becomes once the arrangement it was built around has been switched off. Frances Fetherstonhaugh left Uppark to Colonel Keith Turnor, who lived from 1848 to 1930. There was a condition attached. He was required to take the family name. That is a small thing, and it is not a small thing. An estate of this sort was not simply property to be handed on. It was an identity with a house attached, and the way you kept the identity going, when the blood ran out, was to make the next occupant answer to the name. The house outranked the person inheriting it. In 1911, the collection was sold. Not damaged, not lost, not seized. Sold deliberately by the people who had inherited it. A great deal of what Sir Matthew and Sarah Letheulier had brought back from their grand tour between 1749 and 1751 went out of the doors. Pieces from Uppark are now in museums in the United States. So the objects Sir Matthew and Sarah brought back from Europe between 1749 and 1751, which had sat in those rooms for more than a century and a half, were dispersed by their own descendants. The building stayed. The proof of the money left. Think about the direction of that traffic for a moment. The fortune that bought the house had been assembled at a distance through the East India Company and land speculation in North America. A century and a half later, the objects that fortune bought were traveling back out again, across the Atlantic, to be looked at by other people. In 1931, the house came to Admiral Sir Herbert Mead, who lived from 1875 to 1964, and who also took the Fetherstonhaugh name. He carried out major repairs. His wife, Lady Margaret Mead Fetherstonhaugh, who lived from 1888 to 1977, did something more unusual. She undertook textile conservation work on the house's fabrics that became internationally recognized. Notice what that is, structurally. It is the mistress of the house doing skilled, patient, physical work on the contents, by hand, in order to keep the appearance of the rooms intact. It is the same category of labor the house had always required. The difference is only who is doing it and whether they are paid. In 1954, the Mead Fetherstonhaugh family gave Uppark to the National Trust, and it opened to the public. Some of the family remained living there. So by the middle of the 20th century, the house had made a complete circuit. It was built to be run by staff who were never seen. It passed to people who had to be renamed in order to keep it. It sold the objects that justified it. And then it was handed to an organization whose entire purpose is to show it to strangers. The kitchen block, northeast of the house, red brick, hipped slate roof, turret cupola on top, was by then just a building. The passages under the roundel were just passages. The last dinner had crossed that ground in the 1890s, and the arrangement that had required 10 cooks in 12 years and 1 exhausted housekeeper was, by any measure that matters, finished. Which is the state Uppark was in on a summer afternoon in 1989 when men went up on the roof to work on the lead. The house had one more thing to do to itself. On 30 August 1989, while Uppark was open to visitors, it caught fire. The cause was work on the roof. Builders were replacing lead work, and the National Trust's position was that the fire was caused by negligent use of oxyacetylene equipment. Elsewhere, the account is a blowtorch and lead flashing. Either way, it was hot work on a lead roof on a summer afternoon. There is a phrase used in the building trades for this kind of work: hot work. It covers anything involving flame, sparks, or high heat on a site, and it comes with rules, because the whole point of the category is that it is the class of job most likely to set a building alight. The account from West Dean College, a few miles from Uppark, is that the lead workers ignored those rules. The trust's managing land agent for West Sussex, Peter Pierce, had signed the contract with the builders who caused it. The fire took the roof and the upper 2 floors. The garret and first floors collapsed down into the lower floors. Everything in the garret and on the first floor was lost completely. What happened next is the part worth slowing down for. Staff, volunteers, and firefighters went into the ground floor showrooms and started carrying things out. They saved 95% of the valuable furniture and works of art on that floor. Consider the physical situation those people were in. A house on fire above them, a ground floor full of objects that had been in those rooms for 2 centuries, and a decision, taken repeatedly, about what to pick up next and which way to carry it. That is, in a strict sense, the same task the house had always demanded. Move irreplaceable things through a building on a deadline you do not control, in an order that matters, without dropping them. The only difference is that this time, everybody could see it happening. The staircase hall took the worst of it. The National Trust records that the fire burnt fiercest there, and that only a single newel post and 2 balusters survived. The little parlor was destroyed when a falling chimney stack carried the whole room down into the basement. Down into the basement. Into the floor where the still room and the butler's pantry and the housekeeper's room are. And then the fire went out, and the National Trust had to decide what to do with a Grade 1 house that had lost its roof, its upper floors, and 5 stucco ceilings, and had kept most of its contents. The trust decided to put it back, and the way they did it is the strangest echo in this whole story. They gridded the burnt house as though it were an archaeological site, so that they would know which part of the building any given piece of ash had come from. Then they collected the debris, all of it. It went into 4,000 plastic dustbins, 4,000 bins of burnt house, catalogued by origin. Then the contents were sieved. Archaeologists went through the debris to recover fragments, and the fragments were used as pattern pieces to draw from. For part of it, they used a giant riddling machine that had been developed by the Ministry of Defense to sift out bomb fragments. Out of that process came architectural fittings, pieces of gilded woodwork, and scraps of damask wallpaper. 5 stucco ceilings from the late 17th and 18th centuries had been reduced to several thousand pieces. To rebuild them, the project recruited ceramic artists through advertisements in art magazines and taught them to copy the surviving decoration. They worked upside down, in a large tin shed on the site, against a timetable set by the insurers. Local craftsmen carved 132 oak modillions for the cornice. A Sussex potter named Mick Pinner hand-threw 43 replacement chimney pots. The windows were reglazed with handmade glass. Lime mortar was mixed the old way. West Dean College, a few miles away, supplied craftspeople, expertise and facilities, and a number of the conservators trained there went on to found companies off the back of the work. The whole thing took 6 years and was, at the time, the largest conservation exercise the National Trust had ever undertaken. Peter Pierce, the trust's managing land agent for West Sussex, was put in charge of it at 6 in the morning after the fire started. 6 in the morning. That is the hour the household manuals of the 1880s gave for the beginning of a servant's day. It is the hour at which the fires had to be laid, so that the rooms would be warm without anybody having been seen to warm them. There is one more thing about the Restoration that belongs in a story about knowledge being held in people rather than in documents. Uppark did not start from nothing. The project drew on what had been learned from the earlier fire at Hampton Court, and when Windsor Castle burned in 1992, 3 years into the Uppark work, what had been worked out in the tin shed on the South Downs went on to Windsor. That is a transmission chain, and it is the same kind of chain the house had always depended on. One set of people who had done a difficult thing under time pressure, handing what they knew to the next set, because the knowledge did not exist anywhere else in usable form. The difference is that, this time, somebody wrote it down. The insurance argument went all the way to the House of Lords, where the trust and its insurers eventually won. The case is reported to have generated over 4 tons of paper. And when it was all finished, in 1995, the point of the exercise was that you would not be able to tell. That is the joke at the center of Uppark, and it is not a kind one. The house was built to hide the labor that produced it. It burned down. And the largest restoration project the National Trust had ever attempted was 6 years of archaeologists, riddling machines, and ceramicists working upside down in a shed. All of it was undertaken to produce a building that once again looks as though nobody had to do anything to it. Uppark reopened in 1995. The National Trust reports the main house restoration at £20 million. On the principal ground floor floorboards, the boards the volunteers ran across, there are still burn marks, and they have been left there. Go into the basement today, and the rooms are still laid out the way the household used them. The still room, the butler's pantry, the lower servants' hall, which now holds a small exhibition about the fire and what came after it, and the housekeeper's room, which the National Trust describes in a single line as once home to the mother of H. G. Wells. That is how she is recorded, in the room where she kept the accounts and the stores and the schedule of a house whose kitchen was in a different building. Not by her own name, by her son's. Outside the front door, the gravel is still gravel. Under it, the 2 passages from the working blocks still run in and still meet the 3rd passage from the back of the house, at the junction described in the listing, beneath the roundel where the carriages pulled up. Nothing travels through them now. The kitchen block stopped being a kitchen in 1895, after Miss Frances Fetherstonhaugh died, and it never started again. You would not have survived a working week at Uppark, not because the labor was beyond you, and not because you would have been starved or beaten. You would not have survived it, because the house had been designed to conceal its own operation. That meant the operation existed only in the memory of the people already doing it, and nobody was going to be able to spare the time to put it into your head. Sarah Wells had that knowledge, more of it than anyone, for 13 years. She was let go at 69 with 3 sentences in a diary and no pension. The passages are still there. They are the only part of the arrangement that did not have to be rebuilt.